go. So welcome to our next session on education and the pandemic. So in this session, we will hear from Deborah J. Cohan talking about rethinking what we value, pandemic teaching and the art of letting go. We'll then hear from Stacy Smith, Adam Sanford, and Dinur Blum on spotlighting hidden inequities, post-secondary education in a pandemic. We'll then hear from Millar, Bidwell, Scott Grether, and JoEllen Pederson on disruption and difficulty, student and faculty perceptions of the transition to online instruction in the COVID-19 pandemic. So the way we're going to organize this is that the speakers will go in turn, and then at the end of all of their talks, we'll open it up to the audience for discussion and for question and answer. So to start off, I'm afraid Deb isn't quite with us yet. Hopefully she'll be able to join us a little later. So Stacy, Adam, and Dinur, if you guys wouldn't mind kicking us off. Sorry to throw you a little out of order there, but hopefully Deb will be able to join us in a little bit.
Sure, no problem. Let me, oh, Deb's here. Great.
Oh, Deb is here. Sorry, let me try to make her go. There she is. Hi, Deb. Are you there now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry about that. You know, I have to confess, in our first session of the day, we had quite a Zoom bomb fiasco. So we had to put a little stricter security controls on this. And at first, I have to say, I was a little excited because I hadn't been Zoom bombed before. I kept hearing about it. I hadn't experienced it. It wasn't quite the experience I wanted, though. So we had to put a little tighter security. So I apologize for that. But glad to have you with us, Deb, as always. So sorry, Stacy, Deb, if you want to kick us off, please.
Sure. Is it supposed to be this way where my video is not working?
Supposed to, but let me see here. Are you able
Not
to?
Because of the bombing, because I only see two people who look like they're on regular video. I don't know who they are, but they're two women.
You're a co-host, so you should be able to show your video.
Yeah, it's just when I made a co-host. Oh, okay.
Now we see you. Now we see you.
All right. No, this is just, it's so weird with different meetings. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good night. I don't know, whatever it is for people in different places. It's so good to be part of this. My gosh. So this is exciting. I mean, it's just exciting that these books came out when they did, as fast as they did, in response to something that is so, you know, that we're living in. It's so of the moment. So I'm delighted to be part of this and interested in the conversation that we can kick off. So I just want to thank you, Michael, again and again. I've thanked you so many times for this, but it's like, it doesn't even seem like enough, because it's just like dazzling to me that this could bring this many people together from so many different places. So so totally delighted. And it's just such a reminder for me at a time like this that, you know, when we look back on lots of different times of history, even when we weren't alive, crisis often gave way to opportunity and gave way to art making and gave way to writing and all sorts of things. And this whole endeavor that Michael has kicked us off with is certainly an example of that, this kind of thinking and art making that we're all part of here. So I'll give you a little bit of a taste of what my chapter is about and what I'm kind of continually thinking about with this. And that's this whole issue of pedagogy and at a moment of real crisis in higher education systems. It seems like there's been sort of a calling out for questioning anyway. And then the pandemic certainly kind of wakes us up further to thinking about, you know, kind of what are we doing? What is this all about? What is this all for? I'll say that at the same time that the pandemic was starting to unfold, that was also the very same moment that my first book came out, and that was and still is kind of a passion project for me. It's a memoir, and the poster of it is behind me. And this is the book, Welcome to Wherever We Are, a memoir of family, caregiving, and redemption. And it's about caregiving for my father, who had been emotionally and verbally and financially very abusive and controlling. But he was a man that I adored and still do, though he's been gone for almost 9 years. And the lessons that I learned in dealing with and healing from abuse, and the lessons that I learned from caring for my father and from writing about this, started to actually, interestingly, overlap with and kind of coalesce with some of my thinking about pandemic pedagogy. And so some of the themes of the book actually reverberate into how I think about pandemic pedagogy, and also how I'm thinking about pedagogy, even maybe if we're not living in an immediate pandemic situation. So it's just kind of, one has sort of echoed the other in a way. So the book is completely a meditation on what we hold on to and what we let go of, how we remember other people, and how we're remembered. It's also a meditation on what home means. And it seems to me like those ideas, those kinds of ways of meditating on these kind of big human issues, end up being part of how we think about pandemic pedagogy, frankly. Because I'm constantly, and I have been since last March, really thinking about what part of this class, this syllabus, the content that I'm dealing with, what part of it do I really want to hold on to? Anything, something, and what can I let go of? And where can I model that sort of letting go for students? And to do it in a way that still retains, rigor and everything, but that has a certain amount of, flexibility, and just a sense of like, not too tight, not too loose, the kind of Buddhist idea in a sense. And also thinking about, like for me, home has been many, many places and many people and many different things in my life. It's not static, but one place I've found home is in the classroom. And I have had to remake that sense of home over the years many times. I started teaching when I was 25. I'm 51. And, it's like over half my life. And so it is a home I've come back to. It's a home I've had to remake this year online. I was a scathing critic of online education and have now begun to find ways to make it work. But there's lots of different pieces and parts to the online thing. And one of the things that has really, I've always been a critic of, is just how much people are sort of fetishizing the methods of teaching, and they do that in person too. And so one of the things I really tried to do is to step back and to stop fetishizing. I'm not interested in like every method of everything. It's like I'm more interested in, like, as Parker Palmer points out in his book, The Courage to Teach, it's really about the relationships. It's about the connection with students. It's about the connection to ourselves and our own sense of integrity. And those are the lessons that seem to be much more important, especially through a global crisis, than any of these other things. Someone's saying that they love Parker Palmer, and I do too. It's when people say like, well, what book should you read to be an educator? I say, 2, and then please abandon the rest. Like a lot of the education books just really they're not good. So, because it's not such a formula, but certainly Parker Palmer, and I also think Bell Hooks's book, Teaching to Transgress, is pretty beautiful. So, one of the things that I can say also is that in writing my own memoir, which is about grief and loss, and also then how I came to choose joy and to deal with unpredictability, because that's what happens when you're navigating an abusive relationship. I was constantly dealing with what was unpredictable, but then still trying to make sense of that and find ways to cultivate joy, to choose joy, to make a life that's healthy and joyful, those sorts of things. And so I find that those are really important lessons to impart to students too, especially the students I teach who have come from some very, very challenged, compromised backgrounds, so that the pandemic just sort of is another layer of crisis on top of lots of other crises. And the other piece that's a theme of my book is just that no one and nothing is all good or all bad. That even my dad, like, who was an abuser, was also adoring, even though he did a lot of stupid crap to me and to others. He was brilliant, even though he was this, he was that. Like, there's always, it's like the both and I think the same is true for the pandemic. That there are places in it that people are trying to figure out, like those of us who've survived and who've tried to keep moving forward a little bit. It's like, what parts of this pandemic are we, might we even use to instruct us for moving forward even beyond a pandemic? And so there's that. And so I think that there's a way in which it's not this absolutist thing of, it's all good or it's all bad, but it's both and same with the online classes, frankly, is that I kind of thought of them in a way that was kind of all bad for a long time, even as I was teaching that way, and kind of finding it to be nonsense. And now, like, I really had to reevaluate that. And now I see it's not all good. No, it's definitely not all bad. And there are ways in which, my own memoir writing has gotten me to, I think, probably a more instructive place for my own pedagogy. And so the last kind of thing I'll say with this is just that, writing the book helped me to think about, how to break silences, how to come to voice, how to be creative in the face of things that were, there's a lot of adversity. And I feel like we're trying to impart that to our students. I certainly am all the time trying to do that, and have had some really beautiful successes with it this semester, this year, that may not have happened in quite the same way before. So it's been sort of a willingness to to kind of give some space. I guess that's really the main takeaway of this too, is to just, I feel like I live my life by this idea of, how do I cultivate the most space? How do I, how do I cultivate spaciousness? That's a question I ask myself. And that also guides how I make a lot of decisions in my life. It's also it's a sort of advice I give to friends. Like, would that help you create space, or would it not? And that is something I really try to, certainly show back to my students. I'm eager to read that feedback, whatever that is saying. I can't read it all right now in the chat, but I will in a sec. So I don't want to take too much time. So I think what I'll do is turn this over to the next presenters, and if there's more time, I might say a few more things after in conversation. But I appreciate you listening to this, and happy to talk anytime with any of you individually, or even after this conference, to communicate about this stuff. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Deb. Deb and I have been joking as this has happened that we've spoken together at a number of webinars since we moved along. And honestly, I never get tired of listening to what she has to say. So thank you for showing up and sharing your insights, which are always appreciated. If we could turn it over now to Stacy and Adam and Dinur, if you guys are ready.
All right. As Adam said earlier, we're each presenting our own, the first author, we're doing our own stuff. I swear I'm more coherent than this when I'm not giving a presentation. Thank you, Michael, and everyone for being here, and Michael for organizing this. Let's see, it would help to share my screen, wouldn't it? And I don't know how one says they've read an audiobook, but I listened to Deb's book recently and it's incredibly powerful. I can't recommend it enough. All right, so we wanted to look at how the institution of higher education was handling, how faculty were handling this shift to online learning and how that affected our students. And when we first shifted in March of last year, which doesn't seem possible, but here we are, we really were engaging in academic triage. At Michigan State, where I'm at, we shifted from an announcement that said we might go online for a couple of weeks to we are fully online within 18 hours. So an 18-hour pivot was a lot to handle. I literally went to class, went to campus, I taught one class. At the end of that class, there was the announcement, and then we went home. So very much an academic triage situation. And when we're thinking about online learning, we often talk about accessibility. So we're thinking about things like screen readers or making sure that photos are tagged and so on. But we don't talk very much about equity. And that's what we really wanted to focus on. So the shift online in spring 2020 was experienced differently by students based on health concerns for themselves and their families. Especially, I'm just about 45 minutes from Detroit, and Detroit got hit very hard. And also on educational minutia that many take for granted, some of which has been mentioned already in this conference: a quiet place to study, ample time for schoolwork, and the technology to access the learning management systems, write papers, and complete assignments. We identified 3 general inequities faced by college students during this crisis. One was access to technology. The other was access to a good environment for education. And the final one was access to adequate time. What we did, we looked at, as soon as this all started in March and early April, a couple of very large groups manifested on Facebook. One was Pandemic Pedagogy, and the other one was Chronicle of Higher Education group. They've since, I think, been renamed, one of them. Higher Education in the Pandemic was originally started by the Chronicle of Higher Education. And we went back to the beginning of those groups to look at the earliest posts that we could and looked at posts that gained a lot of traction. So things that had a lot of comments that sparked a lot of conversation. And then also looked at national surveys and then our own combined professional expertise. Just some background, and I think this is something that a lot of professors don't really acknowledge. I am a first generation college student, so this is near and dear to my heart. A lot of faculty don't get it, but our students are facing tuition fees, room and board on average of $23,000 a year. And you know that it can get much more expensive from there. In 2015 and 16, 86% of those students received financial aid. By 2018, students were graduating with an average of almost $30,000 in student loan debt. And our current national student loan debt is $1.6 trillion. So to say that our students are concerned about finances and worried about their future is an understatement. And this is without a pandemic. In 2015 and 16, over half of those students were first generation college students. Close to half, I'm missing a C there, close to half of those students were employed full-time. Close to half of those were employed. Wow, I messed this up. Close to half of our students are employed, 10% of those are full-time. 81% are employed at least part-time, and 47% full-time. In 2018, over half of those students experienced housing insecurity. And 2019, almost half of those were food insecure. And the difference there, that the 31 and 47% depends on whose statistics you're looking at. So our students are paying a lot of money in tuition. They're taking on a lot of debt for jobs that they may not have. And while they're doing it, they're worried about their housing and they're worried about eating. And this is, again, without the pandemic. Pre-COVID, students had a lot of difficulty with mental health. So in 2019, 45% of our students said that they had more than average stress, and over half said the academic experience was traumatic or very difficult to handle. And this table shows you some of the things that students have been dealing with. So things like being overwhelmed, 87% saying they're overwhelmed, 85% exhausted, 55% felt hopeless, 45% depression, enough to just cause disrupt function. The physical campus offers access to technology services and space that mitigate a lot of these problems. So before higher education, we have computer labs, right? We have tutoring, face-to-face tutoring. You have easy access to health facilities and so on. And then post-COVID, of course, that changed. Students want to come back to campus. I know that when this first happened, there was a lot of concern about, we're going to move to online classes and students are going to decide that they like online and they're never going to want to come back to campus. And this is the end of higher education as we know it. Well, that's not true. Students were not happy with the shift to online instruction in 2020. And they prefer being on campus. And it's not, one of the points I want to get across here is that early coverage basically looked at students wanting to come back to campus as students wanting to party. And we have seen plenty of that. They've had to shut down bars around my university, for example, because students were being dumb. But it goes well beyond that. The college experience is not just about getting drunk and hooking up. It's about being able to have those spaces and those experiences in the academic world. So there's no groundswell of interest in abandoning traditional residential college experience in face of an online program. Students understand, or at least have bought into, the value of the in-person experience. So what is it that they get from the on-campus experience? Well, part of what they're getting is a hidden degree. And again, as a first-generation college student, this stuff is pretty obvious to me, but not, I think, to a lot of our faculty. Higher education in our culture serves as an access to tools for class mobility. If you're not born into an affluent family, college affords an immersive environment in which to learn middle-class culture, norms, and tastes. We pulled from Bourdieu and Goffman. So from Bourdieu, you have this idea of habitus and capital, that in the classroom, students are earning social capital. They're gaining social capital by developing social and professional networks and opportunities, whether that's making an impression on a faculty member that they can get a reference from, joining clubs and organizations, or simply forming study groups with their peers that teach them a skill set they may not have already had. From Goffman, we borrowed the idea of presentation of self and of stigma. So when you're coming from a background that does not fit the middle class model, you have to learn a whole other way of presenting oneself. But that working class background or lower class background provides the opportunity for stigma. And Goffman discriminates between the discredited and the discreditable, the discredited being those whose stigma is obvious, that can't be hidden, the discreditable being those who can hide it. But hiding that stigma, whether it's a mental illness, whether it's a class background, whatever it may be, creates a cognitive and emotional load for a student, and a motivation to avoid situations where the stigma cannot be managed. So students who have a discreditable stigma coming into the classroom have more on their mind and more emotional load than other students do. Finally, we pulled from relative deprivation theory. Relative deprivation is the idea, of course, that you are deprived relative to another group. And in the college classroom, the middle class is our normative reference group. In the classroom, college peers are a reference group. And so the college classroom offers students, especially those who are trying to move from one social class to another, offers them a reference group to base their behavior off of. But also, it's a reference group that they judge their behavior off of. So students experiencing inequities of technology, environment, and time experience relative deprivation when looking at their middle-class classmates and even instructors. Their reference group is their classmates and not their social class group. And by comparison, they don't measure up. But again, the physical campus provides some of these tools that minimize these issues in a way that pandemic pedagogy has not. So again, physical campus offers access to technology services and space that mitigate these problems. During the COVID crisis, the shift online damaged students' ability to learn, gain cultural and social capital, and manage their self-presentation while also maintaining the standards and expectations of a middle-class habitus. Previously hidden or managed inequities were revealed to professors and peers. For example, one of my students has housemates, like many of our students do. And in one of our synchronous sessions, one of her classmates walked behind her and went into the bathroom and, did what you do in the bathroom and then flushed and then came back out. And it didn't really, this is a normal thing. These things, we all do this, right? But my student winced when the toilet flushed. So for my student, this was an added awareness of her surroundings and of how she was being interpreted by others, which she clearly thought was a negative thing because of that toilet flushing behind her. Unfortunately, many professors and administrators were more concerned about academic rigor, about cheating, about worrying about exam proctoring and maintaining a real-time synchronous teaching schedule than they were about the inequities that were exposed. And I think we've covered this before, and I don't want to go over time, but I do want to touch on inequities of time because I think this one is hidden more than others. Undergraduates are much more likely to be in those essential jobs. They're much more likely to be grocery store employees. Some places they're much more likely to be medical personnel and so on. A lot of them have caregiving responsibilities. I had a number of students who had to go home to live with their parents and ended up taking care of younger siblings. Requiring synchronous classes plopped students in front of computers for hours and hours and hours on time. We have a bunch of professors that thought students suddenly had a lot of free time and suddenly assigned a whole lot more work to students. And all of these things created problems for students that they would not have otherwise had. So we argue that at minimum, students should not be damaged by the alternate instruction that we're presenting. And that when we do construct courses, we should be mindful of students with different access to technology. We should allow students to manage the window into their backstage. In other words, manage their presentation of self when they're on the other side of the computer, and that we should accommodate students with a variety of responsibilities. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Stacy, for that, and also to Adam and Dinur who contributed to the chapter. I'm a first-generation college student myself, so, and I have, I think, a greater portion of that $1.6 trillion loan debt than I want to have. So I'm really sensitive. I really appreciate your chapter and the suggestions. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And now we will turn to Lee, Scott, and JoEllen for their presentation, if you guys are ready.
We are indeed.
Hi, welcome.
So, all right, you should be able to. JoEllen, are you able to see my screen?
I am.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you, everybody. Welcome to our presentation. My name is Scott Grether. I'm Assistant Professor of Sociology at Longwood University in Farmville, Virginia. And along with my colleagues, Dr. JoEllen Pederson and Lee Bidwell, we're going to be presenting some research that we conducted last year. The title of our presentation is Disruption and Difficulty, Student and Faculty Perceptions of Emergency Remote Teaching During the COVID-19 Pandemic.
As the literature from organizational sociology demonstrates, colleges and universities are organizations that are comprised of individuals who have different status positions and roles. University administrators are high status actors who have legitimacy assured through their achieved status and have more power to make decisions. Faculty are middle status actors who cannot make decisions without considering their high and low status counterparts. While students occupy low status roles and therefore have few alternatives other than abiding by the decisions of those with greater status. During times of crisis, such as that which was precipitated in higher education by the pandemic, it is important to consider how each individual's status within the university shapes their experience.
So like other presentations that we've heard thus far today, this is obviously an unprecedented moment for many of us where we encountered a global pandemic. And so for many of us, the question was, well, how are we going to respond? Especially as faculty, we wanted to know how did faculty, but also our students, how are they experiencing the transition to emergency remote teaching? How did their experiences compare? And how can those experiences inform future crisis responses?
The term emergency remote teaching, or ERT, as Dr. Grether mentioned and was mentioned in a previous presentation, has emerged to distinguish the teaching that occurred online last spring in response to the pandemic from traditional online instruction. High quality distance education requires significant training, carefully planned course design, preparation, and instructor support. Ideally, faculty teach online voluntarily, and students voluntarily sign up for online learning. By any measure, the remote teaching delivered in response to COVID-19 was not representative of online instruction, but instead was pedagogical triage designed to salvage student learning for the remainder of the semester. The abrupt transition to online instruction that occurred mid-semester did not allow for careful course planning and was involuntary for both faculty and students. Faculty who were untrained in online pedagogical practices and technologies were thrust into the virtual learning environment, and even those faculty with online teaching experience and training did not have time to make changes to their courses based on best practices. So in total, we created 4 surveys, one for faculty and one for students that was sent 1 week after our university went online, which was March 20th of 2020. And then we created 2 new surveys, one for faculty and one for students, during the last week of that we sent out during the last week of classes, which was on April 25th, 2020. We sent the faculty survey to a list of 130 faculty at our university. At time 1, 60 faculty responded, and at time 2, 54 faculty responded. At time 1, 310 students responded, and at time 2, 87 students responded to our survey. Because of our sampling technique, we don't know how many students actually received the survey, and so our results are not generalizable, but we feel they present an important snapshot of a very timely situation. So based on the data we received, overall faculty and students agreed that the shift to online education was necessary in the spring of 2020.
Our data yielded 3 additional themes that we are going to be discussing in detail today. The first theme is that concern for balancing work, school, and family obligations was the top concern for students during this time. The second theme that we'll be discussing is the concerns over changes to course material. And lastly, we'll be discussing student and faculty perceptions of students learning less during the spring of 2020. On the graph on the screen, you can see the answers of a question that was asked at time 1 and time 2. And the question specifically asked students to rank their top concern during the switch to emergency remote instruction. On the faculty survey, we asked faculty to rank what they thought students were most concerned about. Students were most concerned about balancing work, school, and family obligations in both time 1 and time 2. That's the green and the orange bar. Only a quarter of faculty respondents at time 1 thought that students would be most concerned about balancing work, school, and family obligations. That's the yellow bar. At time 2, most faculty, 57.4%, estimated that this would be students' biggest concern in moving to ERT, and that's the pink bar. This shows that faculty realized how difficult balancing work, school, and family was for students during the 5 weeks in between our surveys.
So when analyzing this theme, balancing schoolwork and family from the student's perspective, there were some very noticeable ways the students in our survey were answering or discussing this theme. Many were discussing that they needed to strike an immediate and intricate balance between completing their assigned schoolwork, managing the frequent announcements they were receiving from the university, as well as their individual courses, while also maintaining all of the policy changes that were being announced by the university, caring for loved ones, and being an essential worker. For a lot of students, this was, as you can probably imagine, very stressful. For example, student 25 in our time 1 survey said, "I'm literally super stressed. I'm having to work while I'm at home to pay my parents' rent. It's just too much." Student 236 at time 31 also echoed this by saying, "It's overwhelming. This is an unexpected lifestyle and routine change. Living at home and balancing academics with family and employment affairs is excessive."
As you saw, the quantitative data suggests that faculty did not fully perceive the magnitude of students' concerns about balancing work, school, and family, especially in time 1. However, they were sensitive to these issues. One of the first decisions faculty had to make in the transition to emergency remote teaching was whether to deliver their course content synchronously, asynchronously, or some combination of both. Regardless of the choice that they made, in open-ended survey responses, faculty described how their perceptions of students' needs shaped their pedagogical decisions. In addition to concerns about students' multiple demands, faculty also were concerned about students' internet access at home. Although not mentioned as often, some faculty also had concerns about balancing their own work and family responsibilities. For example, faculty 005 in time 1 said they were using, quote, "a balance of synchronous and asynchronous teaching because it's the only possible option I have given the upheaval in childcare and schooling."
Students consistently reported that changes to course material caused by COVID-19 was one of their greatest concerns. At time 1, 17.5% of students reported this was their top concern. That's the green bar. 19.5% of students listed changes to course material as their top concern at time 2. That's the orange bar. When classes initially shifted to an online format, faculty recognized changes in course material were likely one of students' primary concerns, with 18.6% of faculty selecting this as students' top concern at time 1. However, only 1.9% of faculty felt that the changes to course material would be students' top concern at time 2 in the survey. That's the pink bar.
And again, students talked about the changes to course material in very distinct ways, perhaps as a reflection of their organizational status. They were concerned with how instructors were adjusting the workload for individual classes. They consistently critiqued changes to the adjustments that their professors were making. They perceived more coursework was added during emergency remote teaching. And these concerns were inevitably linked to concerns about balancing schoolwork and family during an ongoing pandemic. For example, student 290 in time 1 said, "It's been an emotional roller coaster. I feel like my professors have not given me and other students time to mentally process what's going on. They were more worried about shoving content down our throats versus checking in with us to see if we were okay." This concern also held to the time 2 survey. For example, student 11 said, "A lot of professors are assigning extra activities, sending too many emails at once, and for me, it made the process harder."
Like students, faculty had no choice in moving to emergency remote teaching. The emotions created by the sudden transition, feeling overwhelmed, frustrated, and stressed, described by faculty echoed student sentiments. Faculty respondent 014 in time 1 said, quote, "I am just short of all out panic all day, every day." During the transition to ERT, faculty adapted their courses for online instruction based primarily on 2 factors: perceived student needs, as previously mentioned, and pedagogical considerations designed to maintain the integrity and continuity of their courses. Faculty thoughtfully considered a myriad of issues in deciding how to best transition to ERT, including the original objectives of the course, the nature of the discipline, class size, whether the course was lecture-based or had an experiential component, whether it was for majors or non-majors, graduate or undergraduate, entry level or upper level. Given the many variables shaping faculty choices and their desire to deliver the highest quality course to students under the circumstances, it's not surprising that faculty were resourceful and creative in using a variety of technologies to deliver their content. Faculty mentioned using Canvas, FaceTime, Google Slides, Panopto, online polling, publisher-provided products, Skype, Slack, Camtasia, WebEx, and Zoom. And then depending on the course, faculty delivered the content either synchronously, asynchronously, or a combination of both. However, the unintended consequence of faculty using such a wide variety of technologies and course design was that students often were confused and perceived a dramatic increase in workload.
The last closed-ended question we are presenting today was only asked on the time 2 survey. The question asked students and faculty how much students had learned during the emergency remote portion of the semester. 67.9% of students felt that they had learned less than they would have during a quote-unquote normal semester, and 59.3% of faculty felt that students had learned less.
And so this theme also, again, is very distinct in the way students discussed learning less. Many students expressed a range of difficulties at time 1 associated with online instruction. But noticeably, the greatest perceived difficulty was the perception that they would learn less than in the traditional classroom setting. And this concern held across surveys where students emphasized they were learning less from emergency remote teaching instead of in person. For example, student 58 in time 2 said, "I honestly think this was a waste of money. I didn't pay for online classes. I am doing work without even learning any material, honestly." Student 70 echoed this by saying, "I understand why it was necessary because health must always come first, but I'm barely learning anything and I'm miserable on all fronts."
Despite the thoughtful ways that faculty approach course changes and the many strategies utilized to deliver content, the majority still believed that students learn less in the online environment. In their open-ended comments in both surveys, faculty consistently expressed concern that ERT was not as effective, rich, engaging, or desirable as face-to-face instruction. Faculty remarked that they, quote, missed seeing the students and being able to talk directly to them, and that because material had to be cut or compressed in the shift to ERT, students literally learned less content. Some respondents worried about, quote, the effect down the road for courses that build on one another, especially in math, science, and languages. Given that they chose to work at a residential university that prides itself on teaching excellence in small in-person classrooms, it's not surprising that many of our faculty respondents were critical of online instruction in general. However, many faculty respondents made a distinction between the instruction being delivered as a result of the pandemic and teaching online courses in general. These faculty, it seemed, recognized that they were not offering a true online course, but rather ERT. Faculty respondent 032 remarked, quote, viewing the process as disaster relief rather than proper online teaching has helped a lot not to worry about the things that aren't quite right because they would need a lot more planning. So what can we take away from this research? First, we believe colleges and universities should develop or revise their continuity of operations plans or crisis COOP plans using input from middle and low status actors. Second, greater guidance for instructional delivery during a crisis must be created by and provided to faculty to allow for more continuity in students' learning experiences. Third, institutions must prioritize instructional design centers as a critical part of their infrastructure to support virtual learning in a crisis. And finally, when a crisis necessitates significant changes to course delivery, clear and transparent communication between actors of different statuses is essential. Higher status actors must solicit input from lower status actors to make the best decisions and understand all of their implications. Furthermore, decision makers must clearly communicate changes that are being made, explain why, and identify expectations. Thank you all for joining our session on education in the pandemic.
Thank you. That was another excellent presentation. I enjoyed the presentation as much as I did reading the chapter, so thank you for being with us today. One thing that struck me as I've been listening to these three presentations is the way that they all sort of come together, and in a way that I very much appreciate, that they all take account not just of students or not just of faculty, but as seeing those two populations as interrelated. I've read a lot of work on education in the pandemic, in addition to my own experiences, as many of us have, and a lot of it seems to focus just on the students or just on the faculty. And I think a lot of that work misses the key points that came out in our presentations today. So I really appreciate the way all of the work has looked at these two as inseparable populations. We can't be faculty without students, students can't be students without faculty. I also appreciate the way in which the three presentations have been human. Maybe that's not what I'm supposed to say as an academic, but it's something I always appreciate, when it's not just strict rigor and methodology, but there's an understanding that there's human beings behind these numbers, there's human beings behind these concepts, that we have debts, we have families, we have days when we don't want to get out of bed. We all experience that. And I think taking account of that humanity is something that also emerged in the research that was presented today. So I appreciate that. I'm sure students appreciate that. Overall, I'm really happy to have had everyone, and especially in conversation, I think it's just great. So with that, I'd like to open it up to the rest of the audience. If you have a question, please just raise your hand on the Zoom or type it into the chat. And Adam, we'll start with you.
So I have a question for Scott and your group. In listening to your presentation, I heard a repeated emphasis on status, status, status. And in Stacy's work and our work on inequity, and in my work on bureaucracy, we talk more about these are the rules that you are allowed to work with. You know, that if you are a student, these are the decisions you get to make. And if you're faculty, then these are the decisions you get to make. And looking at it more as just, this is the bureaucratic lockstep. And in the case of the inequities question, more of a sort of misperception of off-campus status, where most faculty don't or didn't until this happened really get at this level that many of our students aren't middle class, that many of our students don't have a middle class situation. You know, as Stacy was talking about, you know, how we tend to assume that all students are middle-class students, that they have a home where they have a bedroom with a desk and privacy and all that stuff. And that really just was upended. How do you think what we were talking about in our two chapters relates to what you're talking about in yours? I'm seeing connections, but they're not clear yet. And I'd like to get your feedback on that.
I don't know who wants to take that one.
No, I'm processing. I'm sorry. So I think when you were talking about the bureaucracy, we looked at it through a status lens, and you looked at it through a bureaucracy lens, and I only caught some of your presentation, Adam. I'm sorry. You're from the time before, but so I think that's interrelated. I think so. I'm faculty senate chair, and when you were talking about at my university, which is our shared governance body. And so when you were talking about bureaucracy, I kept thinking about shared governance and like its role in all of this. And I think too, when we were writing our chapter, I was thinking about that and how in that emergency situation, which was like the initial, like, okay, drop everything, move things online, it really was those high status actors who made the decisions, and they were top-down decisions. Now, we've been back in person since August. And so all summer, as faculty senate chair, I met with administrators and faculty senate, specifically exec, to get sort of the policies that would enable us to move back in person in place. So there we had more time. It was summer, so like we were able to meet and plan for the fall. Now, we did not include students in those conversations at our school. We have since then, and they've been actively through their shared governance, well, SGA, Student Government Association, have given us a lot of feedback on what they want changed. So it was still sort of top down, right? But now we're including two status actors making decisions about how students would interact in the fall. And that's not totally answering your question, I realize, but that's what I was thinking about when you were presenting and when Stacy was presenting, when I was thinking about like how you all were looking at it and how we were looking at it. I don't know if Scott or Lee
Yeah, I think for our paper, we were very sensitive to who was making decisions at our university, who had access to power, to institutional power. And for many of our responses, when we were trying to make sense of this theoretically, sort of this status-based approach made the most sense because students didn't have any control or power or influence in shaping their decisions about their courses. And some of the remarks, Adam, that you and your colleagues were making earlier about having your cameras off versus on, being in certain rooms of your house, those are certainly some things we picked up as well. And for us, it made sense to sort of talk about this of institutional power. And, you know, something else we didn't really touch upon and we didn't really account for in our survey is that we didn't even touch upon the staff and non-academic people who come to the university and work. And these folks also have an important role and important place in all university settings. And universities could not function without people who clean the classrooms, who take out the garbage, who make sure that the offices function properly. So this is another sort of I guess limitation of our studies that we didn't survey staff, but this is another thing, at least for our work, where it made sense to talk about status and where people fall within this organizational hierarchy. But I did appreciate your discussion about sort of the, you called it the outcome-based actors and process-based actors. It was a very, very interesting way to sort of understand, things that we all were experiencing during this time period.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that I think it was a learning process for all of us. I mean, in terms of Stacy, I think it was you brought in Goffman and us seeing behind the curtain, and it a lot of us, as soon as we made this transition, thought, well, they were students, they were in class at this time on these days, what's different now? And it took us a little while to realize that they had assumed some other responsibilities. And you know, if I can see a silver lining in any of all this, it's that we did get to see behind the curtains. Not only did we get to see their dogs and cats, but, you know, we did see the inequality. We had students that, you know, libraries were closed. They didn't have internet access at home, or they were sharing so much internet bandwidth that they drove to library parking lots and sat there and took classes in their cars through their phones. I had a student who left his phone on one time in the middle of a class. He didn't realize his mute button wasn't on. There was all this noise, and I asked him, "Was he okay?" And later on, he emailed me and said, "Oh, sorry, I'm working as a roofer right now. I was on the roof and forgot my phone was on." I mean, so we got to see behind the scenes. They didn't get to see us behind the scenes with us, and so I think that's why there was this perception that we were dumping things on them that wasn't carefully planned, but. But I think faculty members in long term, like if we think what might be different long term, is folks who taught during this time are going to have a deeper appreciation for the inequalities. And not all students are middle class and well resourced.
Yeah, I think those are really good answers. We have just a couple minutes left, but I'm going to hog the floor here for a minute and pitch out a question, because the three of you kind of took more of a Western perspective, or I sort of read it that way. Of sort of, I'm thinking about universities in the US and in Canada, maybe Western Europe. I happen to be teaching at a university in Kazakhstan. It functions very much like a Western university, but there are definitely some key differences. But I've taught in other universities in other places. And I was wondering if maybe in our last couple of minutes, you could just briefly comment if you have any insights on sort of the potential translatability of your findings to a broader global context.
Something that Adam and Dinur and I have talked about quite a bit is this idea of compassion. We complain a lot about higher education being seen as a commodity. It's becoming increasingly commoditized, and students think they're paying for a grade and etc. But by the same token, I think we often look at our students in the same way. They are a body in the chair for a limited amount of time, and we see them as students and as students only. Or maybe we see them as, you know, that student that contributes a lot or has this perspective, but we still don't tend, I think, to think about them very much beyond that. And I think that we are living in a time when we need to stop doing that, when we need to start thinking about our students as whole human beings. And I'm looking at it as invoking the sociological imagination and stepping back and rethinking how we look at students, and also what our students need in this rapidly changing environment, and how we can adapt our pedagogy to best meet their needs. I know that's a very general answer, but.
And I'd like to follow on from what Stacy just said to also, many of our students don't realize that we are people. I had students starting, you know, in like April of last year saying, "I never realized that you didn't live in your office. I mean, I really only thought of you as you were on campus and that's it." And I'm all, "Did you see a cot in my office?" And they're all, "Well, we figured it was somewhere you hid it and that you slept in your office." I'm all, "I share my office with 3 other people. I'm an adjunct." But I mean, I'm starting to get emails from students. I've been getting emails from students, like Stacy says, where the students are saying, "It's so helpful to know that you recognize that we are people with lives, that we have other things beyond your class, that we're not just a student in your Soc 100 class or in your Soc 362 class." And I think that also a lot of my students have really been reaching out to me and saying, like, my birthday was a couple weeks ago, and I told my students I will not be in office hours on my birthday. And I got 3 birthday messages from students within like 2 minutes, like, "Happy birthday, Dr. Sanford. You know, you're a person with a birthday. We never thought about that." When I got my second injection, I had the bad side effects, and I was supposed to be grading. And after about 20 minutes of staring at a computer that would not stop doing this because I had vertigo from the shot, I sent my students a text and said, "I'm going to be behind in grading because I'm not feeling well today because of my shot." And I got like 6 students saying, "Don't worry about it, Dr. Sanford, you know, if you need an extra day." But then I had a lot of students who would come to office hours and say, "We never thought about you as a person who would get a vaccination, as a person who has a life outside of the campus." So I think that in order to show that kind of compassion, we also need to start being more vulnerable with our students and letting them know, in addition to being your teacher, I do some stuff off campus. Like Dinur, for example, he's a sports photographer, and he shares pictures of his sports photography with his students and tells them, this is what I do for a hobby. You know, I have a life outside of this campus too. And I know, and because I have one, I know you have one. And I think that both of those need to be happening. I think that pandemic has really shown a spotlight on this problem of we put people in boxes and we think of them as the box.
You know, if I could chime in, something interesting on that point is on my campus, we all happen to live on campus. So all of the 90% of the faculty probably live on campus. I don't know the numbers. I'm going to guess 90 or close to 100% of the students live on campus, and all the buildings are connected through these little tunnels. It's Kazakhstan, so it gets cold. It's too much to go. So sometimes I think I hadn't thought about some of these points because there is so much backstage sharing going on anyway. We're all going to the same grocery store. They might see me wandering the halls in my pajamas, right? There's not really a space between work and home. So this front stage, backstage is something that oh yeah, I forgot. Not everyone lives, you know, their students can get out their binoculars and see in their windows, but I think it's a really, really critical point to think about. And I also really, we're gonna have to wrap up the session, unfortunately, but I kind of want to leave with this point that I pulled out of this of seeing each other as humans and compassion. And I think that's something that we can take as a general lesson globally, as faculty, as students, as something that I hope emerges not just out of education, but out of the pandemic in general. Again, I'm a sociologist, I'm not that optimistic, but I hope so. I hope so anyway. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you especially to our presenters. I hope you will all hang around. In about 10 minutes or so, we will have our keynote address with Professor William Cockerham. I'm very, very happy to have him with us. And he will be presenting on COVID-19 and the other half of the story, the social. So pop back in about 10 minutes and we'll start with that. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.